Good evening, gentlemen. Oh, only 15 minutes late. That's not so bad. We've done worse, right? We blame the rain, right? It was a rain delay. The game was rain delayed. Chapter 6 of the Holy Tanya. We are right in the middle here. We've got some very interesting topics and classes coming up, God willing. This is really... of course, all parts of the Tanya are rich, but there's some particularly juicy and interesting things coming up soon, and starting tonight, hopefully. We'll also have a very interesting class. Chapter 6 is about, for lack of a better term, Klippa and Sitra Achra and other not nice things, right? We spent 4 chapters talking about the godly soul. We're now talking about the animal soul. And in order to understand the animal soul, you have to understand that the animal soul is from Klippa and Sitra Achra. We haven't really talked much about Klippa yet. We've been talking about Sitra Achra. So let's back up, right? The Alter Rebbe says that all thought, speech, and action of the animal soul, and all the faculties of the animal soul, which parallel those of the godly soul, when they are involved in things that are loy lahashem hema, that are not directed towards God, they are instead directed away from God to something called the Klippa and the Sitra Achra. The entire animal soul becomes involved and enclosed in something called the Sitra Achra, which means the other side, right? Which is the Alter Rebbe's name in his paradigm, which we're trying to understand how the Alter Rebbe's paradigm works. That's really what we're in the middle of discussing. But in his paradigm, this is what evil means, or a bad thing is, right? To the Alter Rebbe, bad means non-godly. We have to keep repeating this because it is critically important, right? You can be a very nice person, a very good person, a very moral person, but if your goodness and morality is non-godly, it is Sitra Achra. It is the other option, and there's only 2 options. It's godliness and the other thing. Right? Now, of course, within godliness and within the other things, there's many, many gradations. It's not all holiness and not all unholiness are created equal. There's many different levels. However, fundamentally, it is central and critical to understanding the Alter Rebbe's worldview, and thus the way the Alter Rebbe is going to help us connect to godliness, because that's the entire purpose of the Tanya. Right? It is critical to that worldview to understand that when the Alter Rebbe says something is bad or evil, what does he mean? He means non-godly, right? As we discussed in previous classes, right? You can translate the Sitra Achra, or the other side from godliness, the non-godly side, as unholiness, or if you prefer, it's the demonic side of things. Just keep in mind that the demonic side includes like cheeseburgers and things like that are very demonic, right? And by this definitions, you have to understand it's a broad definition. This definition of non-holy embraces almost, as we will read, God willing, tonight, almost everything that is in our world, the daily experience, right, falls under this category of demonic, which doesn't mean that it's bad in the usual moral sense of that term. It doesn't mean it's something to be avoided. It doesn't mean it's something that's unnatural or undesirable. We haven't said any of that. We'll get into all of that in more detail and what that means, right? We are simply saying that what is good is holiness, and everything else is non-good or bad, if you prefer. The terminology Sitra Achra actually exemplifies this paradigm, this worldview, because Sitra Achra means simply the other side from holiness, right? It is a term in negation. It just means what's not holy, the other side, right? So we're not judging what it is or what its quality is. We are simply saying, when we call something Sitra Achra, that it is not holiness. As to the Alter Rebbe's view of not holiness and what we're supposed to do with it and how we're supposed to relate to it or not relate to it, etc., that all remains to be discussed. We haven't got to that yet. And when we get to that, we'll see how we get, God willing, moral complexity and all the complexities of regular Jewish life out of this paradigm. But nevertheless, this paradigm is important. This worldview, where it's holiness and everything else, is critical to understanding the entire project of the Alter Rebbe. If you don't understand it, you're just going to end up at dead ends later on. You have to understand this. A different way we've been saying it, or not a different way, but rather, what's the opposite? So Sitra Achra means the other side from holiness. So you have to define holiness there. You have to define one of them, right? You can't just say Sitra Achra is the opposite of holiness and holiness is the opposite of Sitra Achra and leave us there, right? So the Alter Rebbe defines holiness and he says, what's holiness? Holiness is the presence and indwelling of godliness. That's basically what it is. It is the presence of God, the indwelling of God, the Shekhinah, the divine presence, right? What does calling holiness the divine presence tell us immediately? Number one, it tells us that we cannot create holiness from our end, right? Or as we put it in an earlier class, it doesn't matter what you do with your I am, it never becomes the words of Hashem from your end. Right? Now, God can decide that his words can speak through your mouth. That's a different issue, right? But from your end, you can't take something that is an I, that is a separate self from God, and somehow refine it and turn it into something that is an expression of him. You have to understand it's two different selves. It's two different subjects, right? It's like no matter what I say, it doesn't become you saying it. Right? No matter if you're no matter how good I get at imitating you, nothing I say magically becomes you saying it. In the exact same sense, no refinement of Sitra Achra, even if a person lives a very moral and upstanding, non-godly life, that doesn't make it godly in this sense, right? Because godliness, holiness, means an expression of God. That's the first thing it tells us, that you can't create godliness. The second thing it tells us is that you have to become an expression of the other to become holy, right? You have to become an expression of someone who's not you, namely God, to become holy, which is, in other words, which is a paraphrase of what the Alter Rebbe says, that godliness only dwells in a place of bittul. Godliness only dwells in a place that is nullified to him, which in simple English means, right, you have to become his expression. You have to stop being an I am. You have to stop being your own I, right, and become merely an expression of godliness. This is something we're going to talk about more tonight, God willing, in a moment. Last class, the last time we learned, which I think was 2 weeks ago, we said, isn't everything just an expression of God? That's what we spoke about 2 weeks ago. We said, if holiness is an expression of the divine, well, isn't everything in some way an expression of the divine? After all, everything comes from God, of course, right? So we explained in the last class that there is a difference between receiving internally, face-to-face from God, right, versus receiving from what's called the acharayim, which means the hind part, or behind, over the shoulder, right, holding one's nose. As I was once at a wine tasting in Gush Etzion, actually, where they have a winery. And it was a whole bunch of us from the yeshiva there, and we were doing a wine tasting. And he said he poured the wine into all these wine tasting cups, with the big mouth, right? And he said that before you taste, you have to smell it. He said, but don't smell it like from over here, like it's your enemy, right? You have to smell it like up here, right, close to the wine. So that's the same in Tanya, right? You can receive from God from a distance, like he's your enemy, right, with him holding his nose, or you can receive up close and personal, face to face. And this is the source of the entire difference between what is holy and what is Sitra Achra, between what's Kedusha and what's Sitra Achra, right? Sitra Achra is in denial of its own source. Long story short, we're going to discuss this more tonight as well. And really this emphasis of of how does the Sitra Achra relate to Hashem is really what the term klipa is here to address. And we're going to talk much more about klipa, which is the shell or the peel. Well, that's what we're going to talk about in tonight's class, God willing, because Sitra Achra as a term, very often Alter Rebbe will say klipa and Sitra Achra, right? Each term has its own advantage. The Sitra Achra's advantage we've now explained. It captures this idea that anything which is not holy, right, is from the other side. There's a binary dichotomy. Right? But klipa, as meaning the shell or the peel, is a very useful term or metaphor to discuss, okay, but how does this other side relate to godliness? Because the source of everything is in godliness and in holiness, right? So somehow this thing which is against holiness, which is the opposite of holiness, has to come and not just once upon a time come from, but at every moment, as we're going to discuss, receive its vitality from holiness, right? Ultimately, the things which deny God are denying God with the very energy and vitality that God gives them at that moment. It's God. It's which is why in the first chapter when we learned it, we said God creates things which are in self-denial, right? They're alienated from their own nature. Because ultimately, what is the klipa and sitra achra? It's godly, it derives from God, right? However, in what way is it godly? In a way of klipa and sitra achra, in a way where it's in denial of its own source, when it sees God as distant. We began to explain this just the very beginning. At the end of last week's class, we said that this happens through many, many steps of ilah va'alul, right? God creates a system where each level or world or reality is caused by a prior one, right? Not prior or before in time, right? But prior in terms of causality. Each one is caused and depends on the one that comes before it, even if it's simultaneous, right? Like a chain, exactly, as we discussed last week. It's a very simultaneous causality, is very easy to understand, right? This book is sitting on this table, which is sitting on the floor, right? The book being this high from the ground is not caused by the table once upon a time. It's caused by the table right now. But nevertheless, it's totally dependent on the table. If we took the table away, the book would immediately fall to the ground, right? So even though it's all happening right now, which is the case with Seder Shtalshus, not only is it happening right now, it's happening right here, right? All the worlds we discuss in Kabbalah, which a bit of a difficult thing to wrap your head around, but all the worlds we discuss in Kabbalah are all right here, right now. There's no this whole thing where we neatly separate things in space and time is mostly a this world issue, the physical universe, a physical universe issue. Things in the spiritual world are distinguished not by time and space, but by their inherent quality, which is why they're worlds of truth and this is a world of falsehood, because it makes much more sense to be separated by an inherent quality rather than a technicality of space and time. So all of the worlds are actually here right now, and the whole chain, right, is simultaneous. Everything is depending on the level that came before it, which is dependent on the level that came before it, in a system of ilah va'alul, which we're going to discuss also more what that means tonight, a system of close cause and effect, where the level before becomes the cause of the next level. But the point of the fact that a lot of creation comes about through this process, through a chosen divine process of cause and effect, is that this is what affects the distance from God that allows for Klippa and Sitra Achra to arise. If everything was in direct inner relationship with godliness, right, without anything in the way, without any kind of process, right, then by nature, everything would have to admit to its own divine vitality. Everything would have to admit that I am nothing other than an expression of God, right? You'll note that we don't have a neutral concept of existence to rely on. This is where a neutral concept of existence would be useful in Chassidus, right? Because if you want to explain Klippa and Sitra Achra, you can say, what do you mean? They're things that just exist, whereas holy things are things that exist with a special relationship to Hashem, right? But in Chassidus, as I keep telling you, and in Kabbalah, nothing just exists. There's no such thing as just existing. So in other words, the Klippa and Sitra Achra also have to have a relationship with God, and their nature is determined by the quality of that relationship, which is as all natures are determined determined from the inside by the quality of their relationship to Hashem. And the Klipa and Sitra Achra happens to come about through a certain type of divine distancing, of God making himself distant from the result through an infinite chain of causes, right? Which we call Seder Hishtalshelus, the order of the worlds, Ilava Alul, cause and effect. Everything I'm telling you is more complicated than how I'm telling it to you. Just for one of these disclaimers that occasionally we have to say.
Elaborate.
No, I can't elaborate because then I won't have anything left to elaborate on because it'll all be in shambles, right? Okay. So the goal of tonight's class is to explain better what this means, that the Klipa and Sitra Achra becomes distant from God and ends up denying its own godly vitality through this system of causes and effects, or tzimtzumim, if you prefer. We're going to call them tzimtzumim as well. Concealments or contractions of the divine vitality. I just want to point out that if anyone studied this year's Basi Lagani, which was just Yud Shvat, right? Basi Lagani Taf Shin Chaf Gimel, which was associated with this year, talks a lot about how godliness is within the Klipa and Sitra Achra. So it's actually connected to what we are learning in this chapter. A little bit later in the class, God willing, I'll try and insert a little bit from this year's Basi Lagani. Okay. I'm going to read now. Oh, I left out of the review a very important point, which is that the godly soul is holy. Even one who sits and studies Torah, the Shekhinah dwells upon him, right? We read about. Let's see. Okay, we are a quarter of the way up, maybe even a little closer to the bottom. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 lines up on page 20 in the Hebrew text of the Tanya. In the English, we are halfway through the second column on page 24, where we're saying descending degree by degree. That's where we are in the English. And in the Hebrew, the line starts ha'elamus, right? We're discussing the Klipa and Sitra Achra. We say it comes with Bechinas Acharayim. It comes from the back of godliness, right? From the hind part. Yeah, after it's behind God's shoulder, as explained elsewhere. Or from the external, it comes only from the kelim. It comes from the external manifestations of godliness. More on this tonight momentarily, God willing. As we read. It descends level to level with tens of thousands of levels in the chain-like order of the world chain, descent after descent, says the Holy Tanya and the Alter Rebbe. I just want to point out to you, it's interesting that here the Alter Rebbe says tens of thousands. Elsewhere in Chassidus, we say that there are an infinite number of levels and worlds. Which is very interesting because rationally you cannot have an infinite number of finite things. You cannot have an infinite number of limited things. And people wrote the Rebbe letters asking about this, and the Rebbe's letters back to them are in the back of the Kutei Sichos, and they're interesting letters.
So what's the conclusion? You can leave us saying like that.
Oh, I thought I could just bring up an interesting question and you'd be okay with it. You want the answer? Oh, I'm sorry about that one too. I leave a trail of unanswered questions in my wake. This question, the short answer to this question is that it's not really rationally understandable. It's not. This is.
What kind of an answer is that?
Go read it in the Kutei Sichos and don't blame me. Don't shoot the messenger. The worlds come down derech ilav alul, in a way of cause and effect. Close cause and effect. V'tzimtzumim rabim, and many contractions. The way this works, I just want to take a moment because it's hard to judge what the level of general knowledge is, especially people who've been in the class for a long time. So we've talked about things before, but who knows what's remembered and how it's remembered and whether the connections are drawn. So I just want to take a moment here and discuss briefly, right? Each world receives its inner vitality, right? What's a world? Let's start with that. You will note in Tanya, I think I mentioned this in chapter 1 as well, or chapter 2, that it's very interesting because in Tanya, the Alter Rebbe doesn't care about the world, really, right? In other words, so far, all mentions of worlds have been in the context of souls relating. In other words, the world is the place where the souls relate externally. That's what the world is, right? In other words, you could define it backwards. You could say the souls are things that are in the world, right? So the Alter Rebbe, the exact opposite. Everything is about the souls, you'll see, as the Alter Rebbe is building up his whole worldview. Everything is about the souls, right? The world is us. So you have somewhere that you do your machshava dibur ma'aseh, so out there's a thing called a world, right? But obviously the main reality in all of this is the soul, clear so far. Right. So far, the Alter Rebbe is not really talking much about the world. The world is like an afterthought, right? Is you have a soul, okay? So somewhere out there, like in a distant, not really relevant place, there's this thing called the world, right? So far, we're mostly talking about the souls. I'm just pointing this out to you. It's an interesting fact. I think it's on purpose. I think it's actually very reflective of the Alter Rebbe's whole goal, because as some say, the goal is soul, right? Soul is what it's all about. Tanya is about pnimius, right? It's about an inner understanding. And the real reality is spiritual and the inner world of the soul. The outer world, where things interact externally, right, is important, but it's important because it's not important. It's not important because of an inherent quality. In other words, when you make a dwelling place in the lowest, right, it's important that the lowest be lowest, but that doesn't make it not low. It's the lowest, right? You're making a dwelling place in the world which is lowest, right? The soul is what matters. The soul is where it's happening, right? And as we, for example, as we discussed in chapter 4, we said that you make mitzvahs cannot be sustained, right? Which means the transformation of the world and making it a place for God cannot be sustained without ava and yira, right? In other words, the mitzvahs are all fueled by the soul. It all comes back to the soul. It's all an expression. We even said that even physical mitzvahs can be thought of as extensions of the soul in a way. Right? In other words, the tefillin should be thought of not as a separate physical object, but when you're actually wrapping them, they become a literal manifestation and instantiation of the soul, if you remember that class that we had. Sorry, you were saying?
But it's that the world, the whole purpose of the soul here is to effect here. This
you have to wrap your head around the idea that God is into things that don't make any sense for him to be into. In other words, God is very into the world being affected. What should that make us think about the world? Nothing whatsoever, because it's not rational, right? In other words, if the world was so great, why isn't it so great? Chassidus would ask, right? In other words, if the world is so great, why is it so terrible? And the answer is, on the contrary, it being terrible is the point. You have to wrap your head around this, right? So, therefore, when you're talking about what's real, right? The soul is what's real. The world is not real. The world is terrible. The world is a totally external, God-concealing, as we're going to see. In fact, as we're going to, God willing, conclude the class, if we finish everything I intended to learn tonight, the Alter Rebbe says the world is full of klippa and sitra achra, everything in it, even the good things, and it's full of wicked people, and that's it, right? So, this idea that Chassidus says, carte blanche, as it were, right, that the world is good and it's all about this world, right, depends what you mean. Depends what you mean. If you're qualifying that and saying that we can do things in this world that we can do nowhere else, and the soul benefits from coming to this world, and this world is the ultimate purpose in some sense, in terms of what God wants, right? That's all fine. Then this world is very important. On the contrary, as we say in Yud Shvat, right? Basi Lagani, as the rabbi said last night at the Fabrengen, the world is a garden, right? And it's ultimately a divine place, but ultimately is a very important word. The Alter Rebbe says in Tanya, as we're going to read, this is a world which is not the Alter Rebbe, it's based on the, as we're going to see, based on the Eitz Chaim, that this is a world full of Klippa and Sitra Achra, which is determined by the majority. In other words, all the good things that happen here, you are thrown in the bucket with Klippa and Sitra Achra, right? Wicked people dominate this world, and that's what the world is. The philosophical concept that you may have heard of, that we live in the best of all possible worlds, Chassidus says, punkt verkehrt, the exact opposite, right? We live in the worst of all possible worlds. This is the lowest possible place that could still manifest the reality of God in potential when Mashiach comes.
It's the best world to live in order to do what we're supposed to do.
You can't be so into the Hasidic reversal that you don't understand the Hasidic Hava Amina. It's very important. It's very important because if you only take the conclusion, you'll never understand what's actually going on in Hasidus. If you take that the world is fundamentally good and you don't have any of this complexity, this is all gonna not hit. This is all gonna be non-absorbed.
Not fundamentally good,
right?
But this is the play field. The only play field that we can play in order to do what we do.
So a play field is not a nice place. It's all torn up. It's full of mud. It's gross. No one wants to be out there. So why are you agreeing with me in such a confrontational tone?
Because you said that the world is not important, only the soul is important.
Yes, that is absolutely true.
And that's why
the world is not inherently important. Hear what I'm saying in the way that I'm saying it, rather than force me to qualify with 7 million things, half of which I'll forget, right? So that it will go in. Hear it with the intention that I'm saying it. The world compared to the soul is not important. A reality is a soul reality. God is real, and the soul is real because it's created in the image of God and is a piece of God. Right? And even you can say the Nefesh HaBahamis, you could also throw in, because the Nefesh HaBahamis is also a human soul and is similar to the godly soul. Fine. So you have 3 things that are important, and these are the 3 things that the Alter Rebbe has been talking about in Tanya so far. We're 6 chapters in, the Alter Rebbe hasn't told you any, except mamish in passing, right? He hasn't told you anything about physical matter, space and time, lands. He hasn't talked about a holy land or a holy place. He hasn't spoken about Shabbos or a holy time. He hasn't spoken about God speaking to the Jewish people at Mount Sinai. He hasn't talked about historic notion of Judaism. He hasn't spoken about, except very briefly, turning the leather of the tefillin into holiness. The Alter Rebbe, when he's building from the ground up, says, here's the fundamentals of reality. This is what's real. There's God. God makes souls who are like God. They're like God but created. Souls are elokus shenaisa nivra, the godly soul, right? And you have the animal soul, which is very much like the godly soul, right? But is of, instead of being of kedusha, is from klippa and sitra achra, right? This is what's real. There's a place externally, right? Am I going to tell you that machshava dibur ma'aseh don't matter? On the contrary, Tanya, the whole Tanya is about how what we have control over is machshava dibur ma'aseh, thought, speech, and action. But what is thought, speech, and action? It is the most external manifestation of the soul. These are manipulations and things that are not real. And I have news for you, that a chassid has to know that the world is not real, not the way the soul is. It's not. It has to be secondary. So if you immediately jump to a worldview where you say, the world is the most important thing, you can't be a chassid. You can't understand the teaching that you can't. Well, you're here studying Tanya, buddy, so as far as I'm concerned, Thursday nights for 1 hour, you're a chassid. So I'm telling you that if you want to understand Chassidus, if you want to understand what the Alter Rebbe is getting at, you have to frame it correctly. You know, the Rebbe says the first step of Galus is being machshiv the Olam. The first step of exile is lending more importance to the world than it has. Sicha of the Lubavitcher Rebbe. Okay? The world is external. Internal realities are what's real, right? You don't need the world to connect to God. Why? Because you're a piece of God already, as I told you in Tanya chapter 2. So, as I was trying, before we got into this whole departure, what are we trying to say here? Every level, I'm sure it's my fault. Every level passes on. What's a world? That's how we started. A world, right? A world is, for lack of a better definition right now, Yeah. A world is, similar to what Ronnie said, is a playing field for selves. It's where selves or stage, it's where selves manifest externally. For example, in the divine world of Atzilus, before which we don't really consider it external, so we don't call it a world. Olam in Chassidus, the Rebbe said, I don't know how many times. Olam is Milashon Helem. World comes from the concealment. What does concealment mean? It means that you don't see the whole world as part of the divine self, but you see that there is some kind of external reality. There's things other than the divine self. That's why it's a helem, right? That's why it's a concealment. So you have the self, and then you have everything else that's real, right? Which is itself a concealment, that there's everything else, yes? So in the world of Atzilus, you have only one self, really, which is the divine self. Now, the souls also come from Atzilus, so you could be more precise and say maybe there's other selves in Atzilus, but ultimately, the way the souls are in Atzilus is united with the divine entirely, right? So Atzilus, in the world of Atzilus, you have one self. What makes Atzilus a self-defined world? In other words, when we go and really, the fact is that this is not about because, as I told you, there's an infinite number of worlds, right? So in other words, it's not really simply the distinction between Atzilus and Bria, which is going to be my example. There's infinite gradations in Atzilus, yes. And then Bria is a whole other collection of worlds, which is also infinite, also with all these gradations, right? But what, if for simplicity's sake, we say there's 4 worlds, right? There's really 4 categories of worlds, right? It's like saying there's 39 things you can't do on Shabbos, right? It's 10 million things you can't do on Shabbos. And there's 10 million that you can do, but you think you can't as well. That's a separate issue. So you have 4 worlds. You have Atzilus and Bria, right? Are 2 of the worlds. What makes one world distinct from another? The truth is that what makes them distinct is that they have different vessels. That's really what makes them distinct. What's a different vessel, right? What's a vessel? A vessel is nothing other, we already sort of spoke about it in chapter 4, the vessel is nothing other than an external interface. In other words, the vessels determine the rules for the field of play or the stage, right? The vessels determine what's real in terms of this world. So in other words, the physical world is the easiest for us because it's the only one we understand. Distinguishing between spiritual worlds is very difficult conceptually for us because we see it all from this perspective down here, right? So in the physical world, it's very easy. Physical world is very easy to explain, right? The physical world is determined by physical vessels, right? In other words, what makes something real in the physical universe? Its ability to interact with other things that are physical, really. Even our ideas all interact with physical brains, right? There's never been an idea in this world that someone has actually thought, right, that hasn't been in a physical brain, yes, as far as we know. So there's the spiritual world of Asiya as well, which is also part of our world. So in fact, our world is also super extra complicated because we live in the physical universe, but the physical universe doesn't have its own kalim. Its kalim and spirituality are determined by the vessels of the spiritual world of Asiya. So our world is actually, it turns out, more complicated than you might assume. But the bottom line is, it's a mashal, it's a metaphor, right? The physical world, what's real here are things that have bodies, let's say. Right? You have a guf, if you have a body, and whatever that word means, right? Then in this world you relate. Every world has its definition of bodies, which are called vessels, right? And if you have those vessels, it's real in that world, which is why Atzilus and Bria are in the same place, right? There's no, in other words, you're not what distinguishes the world is what's real at that level of interaction. So in other words, Chesed of Atzilus and Chesed of Bria and Gvura of Bria and Gvura of Atzilus are all in the same place. There's no other place, right? Why don't they detect each other? What makes it seem like it's somewhere else? It's that the vessels are of a different edelkeit, they're of a different level of refinement. They're really from Atzilus to Bria, it's actually at a totally different level of reality. It's the godly to the non-godly. That's why Bria is called the world of creation, because there's a huge jump. But The standards of that world are different, right? So that world, what seals that world, so to speak, and determines that everything in it is of that world, right, is the standards of the Kalim. Yes? So now, there's a chain of worlds, right? Each one causes the next one. What does that mean? Practically speaking, right, it's like a chain. That's why it's called Seder Shtalshalos. In the chain, the lower part of the top link goes through the top part of the bottom link. This metaphor is not accidental. This is actually exactly how it works. The lower part of the top link is the vessel, right, rather than the light. The light is the expression of self within the world. The vessel is the world half of the dynamic. You understand? So in other words, the vessel, the light is like the soul, the vessel is the body, right? The self is expressed in a world, and that world is determined by the vessels, right? Both of the self and of the which then the vessels of the divine self are what define that world. I know this is a lot and complicated. You don't have to get it all now. The main point is this. The vessel or the lower level of the previous world becomes the light or the higher level for the next world, right? What's an easy way to understand this? I'll give you a mashal. I'll give you the metaphor, right? This metaphor is a very famous Hasidic metaphor. It's stated very clearly in a very well-known discourse of the Rebbe Rashab called the Viadaita Moskova, the Maimer Viadaita, which he said in Moscow. One of the great Hasidic discourses, fundamental, often recommended to beginners, because once you learn and understand this discourse, you can apply what it says there to every other discourse in Chassidus. It's very fundamental from Rebbe Rashab. So there, when the Rebbe Rashab describes the worlds, right, of Atzilus, Bria, Yetzirah, and Asiya, right, what's his mashal? What's his metaphor? His metaphor is metaphors. The metaphor is the metaphor. We've discussed this before in this class. What do I mean? So he says like this. Or Ein Sof is like all the discussions that happened in all the rabbinical academies from the time that rabbis were invented, which is after the prophets, right? Basically from Anshe Knesset HaGedolah, down to rabbis in our modern understanding, modern meaning only 2,500 years old or whatever, all the way through the times of the Romans, the times of Rabbi Yehuda Nasi, right? So for a few centuries, right? So you have all the rabbinic knowledge from that time, right? The rabbinic knowledge from that time is like the Ein Sof, right? It's a huge corpus, it's a huge body of information, right? Now what happens? Everyone knows the famous story. Rav Yehuda Nasi sees that people's memory, first of all, is becoming not as good as it used to be. It was still pretty good, by the way. It's not Rav Yehuda Nasi. It's all relative. Yeah. That the memories are becoming not as good, and also external oppressions of the Jewish people appear to be coming back, and maybe he had something like a prophetic foresight of what was going to happen, which is that the Beis Hamikdash was going to be destroyed and the people were all going to be dispersed. And basically, Judaism had to change. Judaism had to evolve in a certain way. Now, of course, Judaism doesn't change, but of course, Judaism also never stays the same either. It's both, and both are true, as we know. So Rabbi Yehuda Nasi does what you're not supposed to do, which is he writes down the oral law, right? Which is something in a book called the Mishnah. The Mishnah here on this shelf, right, has those blue books. On this shelf, it has the English as well and commentary, so it becomes a whole shelf. But in the original Hebrew, without commentary, the Mishnah is like one slim volume at max. In fact, even with the Hebrew commentaries, you can get the entire Mishnah printed as one volume if you want. The Mishnah is very, very terse. The Mishnah is written in 6 orders, but and many tractates within that, but the whole thing is written in a very terse Hebrew. Now, Rav Yehuda Nasi, being a genius utterly beyond our comprehension and a very godly man, decided to compress the entire corpus, the entire body of rabbinic knowledge and rabbinic teaching into one book, like a zip file, right? Like a zip file, which is called the Mishnah. Now, if you don't have a zip file reader, which means you're not, say, I don't know, Rabbi Akiva or something like that, or Rav Ashi or Abaye or someone like that, right? Then when you read the Mishnah, this just says what it says, right? And it means what it means. And it's a very short book. It's a short and nice book, pretty straightforward, right? But as we know, the entire Talmud, which is much, much longer than the Mishnah number 1. And it doesn't even have all the Masechtas of the Mishnah. In fact, it has a minority, less than half, I think significantly less than half of and especially, and then you have the Jerusalem Talmud as well. But if you in the Mishnah, you have only a part of the Mishnah is in the Talmud with the Talmudic commentary, and you get many volumes of the whole Shas and Talmud, and that's only on some of the Mishnayos, right? So if we had Shas on the whole Mishnah, Shas would be much bigger, right? You have this huge work, right? And you have to understand that Shas itself is compressed, by the way, as well. It's also shortened. It's not all the information. Yeah, there's other stuff too, to set the Brises. What's the point of this? The point of this is that if you do have the tools, like the rabbis of the Talmud, like the Amoraim did, to extract, and the early Tanaim as well, who lived after the time of the Mishnah or through the time of the actual Mishnah's compilation. So you have the ability to see in the words of Rav Yehuda Hanassi the entire rabbinic corpus, which is something like what comes out in the Gemara. In the Gemara, you see that every detail and every nakuda, every jot and tittle of the Mishnah contains within it a whole heap of halachas, a whole heap of information which existed before Rav Yehuda Hanassi. So it's basically like an act of compression, or like building a ship in a bottle, right? It has to pass through a very narrow thing, which to Rav Yehuda Hanassi was a complex socio-political situation where they didn't know what would survive. So they made a compressed version, right, as a mnemonic and as a really containing in a compressed form all of that teaching, right? And once it passed through that time, and you have settled sages living in Babylon and Eretz Yisrael after the destruction of the Beis Hamikdash, so they were able to unfold it, right? And that's how you get the Gemara and the rest of all of the thousands and thousands and thousands of rabbinic works, right? It's all just the unfolding of the Mishnah in a way, right? So this is the mashal. This is a mashal, right? How does the Rebbe Rashab say? The Rebbe Rashab says Atzilus is like the Mishnah. The Or Ein Sof is like all that rabbinic knowledge, right? Something like the Talmud. Atzilus is like the Mishnah, right? Why is this relevant to us? Why is this relevant to us? Because the Mishnah is if I may, the Rebbe Rashab doesn't say this. I'm sort of adapting from V'yadaita Moscow, so you'll forgive me. But the Mishnah is a response to outside circumstances, right? In other words, the rabbinic corpus is doing whatever it's doing authentically, right? Now it comes time for a helen. It comes time to conceal all of this rabbinic knowledge. Right? The rabbinic knowledge is now concealed. Why? To exist in a world called the Mishnaic world, so to speak, right? So all of that information is present, right? Godliness is present in Atzilus. Atzilus is totally one with godliness. It's nothing other than all that rabbinic information, but in form, right? How is it? It's according to certain vessels, right? Now, the Rebbe Rashab says, what's Bria? Bria is if you have a very smart teacher who's teaching Mishnayos, as it says in Pirkei Avos. What age are you when you start learning Mishnayos?
5.
5 is Chumash.
Oh.
10. 10 for Mishnah. 10 for Mishnah if you're following the Pirkei Avos structure, right? So 10 Mishnahs for 10-year-olds, right? So you're teaching 10-year-olds. If the 10-year-old who learns Mishnah is as smart as Rashi's 5-year-old, right? A pretty smart 10-year-old. So you're teaching the Mishnah to the 10-year-old, but they don't understand what it's talking about, right? For whatever it is, maybe it's talking about something that doesn't exist anymore now, which the Mishnah often does, right? It talks about, the Mishnah and Gemara talk about foods that we don't have and we don't know what they're describing, right? All sorts of things like that, right? So the teacher who does understand maybe makes a mashal, he makes a metaphor, right? A true metaphor talks about something else that's not the topic under discussion, but it's something that the student relates to, and because they relate to this other thing, right, they can now see through it to see the original teaching of the Mishnah, right? The world of Bria, says the Rebbe Rashab, is like if you made a full and complete mashal for the whole Mishnah, right? A metaphor for the entire Mishnah, right? A metaphor that conveyed the whole thing, and now you have this metaphor. Now, the metaphor is about something else, because Bria is through a tzimtzum, right? Bria comes through, is now there's another creation, right? There's Yeshus, there's a separation that occurs from God, which is why the metaphor talks about something else. But for our purposes, what's important here? What's important here is that how is the metaphor? So in the metaphor, you have two things. You have the external trapping of the metaphor, which is what the student initially appreciates, because it's in their world, so to speak, right? But you also have within the metaphor, you have the Mishnah. So in other words, here's the point of me saying this whole long thing, right? The external reality of the Mishnah is the inner vitality of the metaphor. Understand? In other words, the simple external understanding of the Mishnah, right? Not the Mishnah as the sage who wrote it understands it, right? Because that's already the depth of the Mishnah, right? Which you have to further unpack, right? You're just taking the external trappings of the Mishnah, right? You're taking the text of the Mishnah and what it's trying to say at the simplest level, at the level that's meant to be understood by an outsider, so to speak, not from an insider. That becomes the inner truth of the metaphor. You understand? So the metaphor which is given to the student, like a link, like a chain, right? The lower part of the Mishnah becomes the inner part of the metaphor. Right? The Rebbe Rashab says if you make another whole metaphor for that metaphor, and then another whole metaphor for that metaphor, you have the world of Asiyah. Like King Solomon and his many, many mashalim, his interlocking metaphors and parables. So, you have each world is on the one hand, each step, each tzimtzum, each world is reflective of the inner truth of the previous world, right? But it's only reflective from the outside, so to speak. In other words, it's to bring a student up to speed with what they would see from the outside in the previous world, right? Not from the inside. It's not an expert level, because it can't be, right? Because the metaphor is just trying to convey to you what the thing says. It's not trying to bring you to see it as the writer of the Mishnah saw it, for example, right? Now, the Rebbe Rashab is using this explanation for something else, which is not, it's the mimer is about something else. I'm just using it here to explain to you very basically that each world is defined by the vessels of that world, which in this metaphor is like what the students can comprehend at that time and in that place, right? So you have students that can only appreciate the metaphor at the second level. You have other students who could appreciate the metaphor at the first level, right? These levels can all exist simultaneously, and each successive level gets its meaning and inner vitality and the purpose of the whole thing from the outside of the previous level. So the inside of the metaphor comes from the outside of the Mishnah. Yeah? You understand? Yeah. So, and so they're all interlocked one with the other in terms of what they mean, right? This is like the process that God uses to create things that are distant from him. This is the process that God does to bring something down and bring it further and further away from the knowledge and from the inner recognition that it's godly. What's interesting, the Rebbe Rashab says, is that if Rav Yehuda Hanassi looks at the fourth level metaphor, if the metaphors were made correctly, right, he just sees the original rabbinic corpus. To him, it's totally transparent. Right. It's the same with God. When God looks at all the worlds, right, he just sees the Or Ein Sof from his perspective. There's no occlusion. There's no concealment. There's no helen. Right? Because he was the one who put from the inside, put them into the vessels, right? He sees, did the compression process and then the translation process. He sees from the inside, straight through all of these concealments, and he sees that it's all just one thing. There's no multiple levels. There's no different levels of explanation. It's all just the original rabbinic. Explaining the rabbinic corpus in other words makes it not the rabbinic corpus, makes it not the rabbinic knowledge. What do you mean? It's just the rabbinic knowledge. In other words, it's all the same, right? Where does the concealment come from? It comes from the limitations of your vessels, right? The concealment comes because as a student, I can only understand a metaphor of the second level, but not a metaphor of the first level, right? That's where the concealment comes from, which is why all of the worlds can occupy the same place at the same time and still be separate worlds, right? Because it's like the world of the student. The student is only receptive. He only has the vessels for one level, right? And if you're only receptive after many, many, many levels of metaphor, right? The original message, the fact that it's godly, the fact that it's the Torah of Hashem, right, can become very, very, very weak, so to speak, and very hidden, only vis-a-vis your vessels, if the metaphors are made correctly, by the way. It's only from your perspective, because if you're a student of the fourth level, you don't just have to unpack the fourth level. You have to slowly climb up, right? You have to unpack the fourth level. That gives you the third level. Now I have to understand the third level. And only by unpacking so many levels, right, can you reach the top level. Something like this is the process of how God distances things from godliness. Yes? Okay. Okay. Let's read just a few more words and we'll talk more. Are there any questions so far?
No, we know everything.
Okay, good. Now you know everything. Okay, good. Ad, says the Alter Rebbe, Ad shenismait kol kach ha'er v'achayus miut acher miut, ad sheyachol litztamsem u'lislavish b'bechinas galus toch esa davar hanifrad, which means until the light and the vitality become so diminished with a lessening after lessening, diminishing after diminishing, until they're able to contract and be enclosed in exile within the thing that is separate from God. There's a lot going on here. So let's go piece by piece. Again, the light and the vitality become so concealed after diminishment, right? In a process like this, metaphor wrapped in metaphor, right? Until it's able to be enclosed in exile within something that is separate from Hashem. Okay? In clothing, hislavshus, we've already spoken about this in chapter 4, but let's speak about it again because it's can't get enough out of trying to explain it properly, unlike how I was taught it. The enclothing, right? When you think of someone wearing clothes, is the wrong metaphor. Don't think of it that way, despite the name. There is an aspect of wearing clothes that is like hislavshus, but not all. But there's 3,000 other aspects of wearing clothes that will mislead you if you think that's what it's talking about, right? In clothing is not like a hand in a glove. That's how I used to think about it when I originally learned Chassidus, and nobody taught me differently. So I don't blame myself, I blame them. It's not like a hand in a glove, right? It's not like a body in a shirt, although there is something to that as well. It's much more like the way you are in your own words, or, in our grand metaphor, the way the Mishnah is in the metaphor, right? That's in clothing. What do we mean by in clothing? In clothing does not imply that you're inside something else. That's not the idea, right? When you express yourself, when you speak words, it's not like you are in something that is definitively not you. Right? On the contrary, you're expressing yourself. They're your words. What do we mean by that? We mean you have come to be within something that is not you. That's really what we're saying, right? Not within, not like within in terms of you have become. Really is really the better term, right? You're not just within the words that you speak, right? You become the part of you that you're putting into the words that you speak becomes the word that you speak, right? Or the Mishnah, the external aspect of the Mishnah becomes the inner reality of the metaphor, right? It's not enclosed in something else, right? It is becoming the inner truth of that thing, right? So a hand does not become a glove that it's inside of. A hand sits inside of the glove, right? When we say hislavshus here, we mean in a spiritual sense, it only really happens spiritually. It doesn't happen physically.
So it means it fits in a certain reality, but not in another.
Yes, that is what it means. It means it doesn't just fit in, it becomes that reality, right? That's what we mean by hislavshus, investiture or enclothing, right? It becomes enclosed. When you become enclosed in something, it means you are extended and literally becoming the inner vitality of that thing. So when we say, for example, that the divine speech is invested in a speck of dust to make it exist, for example, as we've said elsewhere in Tanya, in the second part of Tanya, right? That doesn't mean that there's a speck of dust, and then the divine speech comes and encloses itself within it. That's not what it means, right? What it means is that the inner truth of this thing, right? Remember in Chassidus, everything other than God has an inside and an outside, right? Everything has an and a kli. Everything has the interior reality, how it relates to its source, and it has the external reality, how it relates to other things externally, which is what worlds are, right? Worlds are an external relation. So what we're really saying is that the divine comes and encloses itself and becomes something that relates externally, right? It's a slavshus. When God speaks a word and he makes the speck of dust, right, that word becomes the speck of dust. In fact, the whole point of the second part of Tanya is that there is no speck of dust other than the word that is enclosed within it, right? Very much unlike a glove and a hand. There is definitely a glove that is not the hand that is enclosed in it, right? So that's the opposite. It's in a way, it's almost the opposite thing you're supposed to take away. The reason it's so confusing is because there is no real physical hislavshus, at least not in a materialist worldview, not in a mechanical worldview, right? No amount of moving around things will make one thing invested in another in this way. This is a spiritual thing that we're discussing, which is where the confusion comes from. It's not like mechanically putting an object inside another object, right? It is the object, one thing becoming the inner vitality, which means literally becoming the deepest truth of another thing, yeah? That is hislavshus, that is enclothing. So what we're saying is that godliness comes down, the divine light and vitality, two words that we should spend the whole class stopping and defining as well, but we've been stopping and defining too much, so we'll save that one for a different time. The divine light and vitality become diminished so much that they can become the inner reality of something that denies God. That's what we're saying, right? They become the inner reality of something that denies God. When I say the inner reality, I mean its mahus, its essence, its definition, right? It becomes the very core, the thing that makes it what it is, the inner soul, the innermost vitality of something that denies God. So you take what is pure divine expression, right? It's almost like you would go through the process that the Rebbe Rashab was describing with the Mishnah and the level of metaphor, until you get to a point where you eventually explain the entire rabbinic corpus in terms of why Judaism isn't true. Right? Imagine that. Imagine it got so far, right, so far removed from the original intention that you now make a whole mashal for what is ultimately the entire knowledge of Judaism, right? And the entire mashal is about, the entire metaphor is about how Judaism is not true, right? And the Torah is not true, for example. Yeah? That is something like the Klippa and the Sitra Achra. Now, it's very hard to understand because
how does it get there from the 100% truth?
That's that. We're explaining how. The answer is step by step, right? Step by step. Because a mashal, here's the key here, and it's actually in the words of the Alter Rebbe. Because the metaphor is about something else, right? You can go through so many steps of it being about something else that eventually you have something like the metaphor breaking free, right? At a certain level, right? Klippa and Sitra Achra is nothing other than a metaphor that broke free. It denies its own original source. It forgets that it's a metaphor, right? It doesn't remember that it's a metaphor for something else. Now, in truth, it is a metaphor for something else. That's the incredible part. That's what Basi Lagani was talking about this year, right? In truth, even the Klippa and Sitra Achra is a metaphor for something else. In other words, there is divinity within it. There is godliness within the Klippa and Sitra Achra, but it's so concealed and so denied by what the Klippa and Sitra Achra is in itself, right? That the Klippa and Sitra Achra perceives itself as being totally independent, as being totally not a metaphor, right? The metaphor breaks free. It says, I'm not a metaphor for anything. You can make so many metaphors that eventually you forget, or eventually it becomes lost, that there's any inner meaning here at all. That is Klippa and Sitra Achra. Right, Klippa and Sitra Achra, the shell reality or the peel, which we're going to get to in a second, or the other reality from holiness, is something which derives from godliness. It exists to express godliness. That is the original intention, right? The original, it exists because in Chassidus everything exists to express godliness, and if you don't express godliness, you don't exist, as Alter Rebbe is about to say, right? However, you become so far from your own inner truth, from your own inner light and vitality, that you say it doesn't exist. I don't perceive God, and I don't perceive that my vitality comes from anywhere. I perceive myself to be an independent reality. Or as we were saying in chapter 1, you perceive I am. Right? What begins as God telling a story, it's like the characters manage to break free. Right? God makes so many concealments that they're in a story, right? That they don't realize that they're in a story. They realize that they break free. It's maybe another cute way of putting it. What else? The whole, as this is, okay, so the Alter Rebbe says it's within something that's separate, a davar nifrad, right? What does Alter Rebbe mean by that? So this whole story of divine reality coming down applies to things that are holy as well, right? In other words, the Rebbe Rashab's description of the four worlds don't exist only to create Klippa and Sitra Achra, obviously, right? In other words, the Sefer Torah that's in the Aron, which is holy, right? Or a pair of tefillin, which is holy, which is an object of Kedusha, right? Or a divine soul, as we discussed in chapter 2, also comes down through the worlds. You remember in chapter 2, we said that's what distinguishes the levels of the souls, right? The souls all start in the same place, but then some of them are relatively unaffected by their trip down here, whereas others have to go through this process, right? So this is not a process describing only Klippa and Sitra Achra. This is really a process describing all expressions of the divine, right? All expressions of the divine are light in vessel, one level enclosed in another level, even holiness, right? Your pair of tefillin, which is not Klippa and Sitra Achra, which is Kedusha, right? A kosher pair of tefillin comes through this exact process. It comes through all the worlds as we're discussing. What's the difference then? What makes Klippa and Sitra Achra? Klippa and Sitra Achra, it's a davar nifrad, right? It's something that has become separate, similar to what I was explaining
So why three?
before. Why what?
Three Klipot. What's the difference?
Oh, we haven't even got to three. There's actually four, right? If you count Klippas Nega.
No, well,
We haven't even got there. When we get there, we'll explain it.
sorry.
I don't even know there's three in this chapter. So there's an inherent tendency within this thing. Okay, fine. There's an inherent tendency to not be a mere expression of the godliness that's enclosed within them, right? Here is where the mashal of the peel starts becoming very, very helpful, right? Because it's still, how could it be? How could it be that something which is only an expression of the divine, right? So the metaphor of the peel or the shell of the klippa is actually extremely, extremely useful, right? Think of a banana. If you understand a banana, you can understand klippa and sitra achra.
Not women. We can't understand women.
If you understand a banana, right? We've discussed this before in this class. We discussed this back in chapter 1. We'll discuss it again, right? Think of a banana. The banana is a particularly useful example because it has a thick peel that can be removed, which makes it a useful example. But the example like the Tzemach Tzedek would use is a nut, which basically works the same way, right? You have the shell of a nut, right, or the peel of a banana. Yeah, very similar. So the peel starts as part of the banana. Yeah, the peel grows together with the banana. In fact, it is only because of human use and human social experience that we even have an object called the banana peel, right? Imagine the banana had never been discovered, right? what makes it it's parts of the banana, right? There's the inner fruit that's something else called a human being, which the banana knows nothing about, right? Could enjoy eating. And then there's an outer layer, but like what separates fundamentally between the two of them, right? I'm saying on the assumption that God doesn't make the banana to be eaten, which is not true, but you understand what I'm saying. In other words, the thing itself starts as there's just a banana. There's no peel, right? What's a peel? There's different parts of the banana. Right? There's an inner fleshy part. There's an outer part that's more tough, right? But why wouldn't there be? It's it's like we don't talk about a human skin. There's a reason for that. Thank God, right? Because we're much more used to peeling bananas, right? There's no such thing as a human skin, right? But there is such a thing as a banana peel. Why? Because we often remove them. That's why fundamentally, right? It grows with the peel, just like you grow with your skin. There's no such thing as a banana peel, really, right? Go with me on this for a second, right? The banana peel, in fact, as Chassidus would say, and I don't know if this is true in nature, but it's true in the Chassidic metaphor, the banana peel is actually the first part that grows and is the initial part of the banana. In fact, it's been banana longer than any other part of the banana, which in fact shows on its greatness how much banana it is reflected by how long it's been there. In the metaphor, this is going to be that Klippa and Sitra Achra actually has a very lofty source, right? And initially, the banana exists, the peel exists with a vital function, which is to protect, right, the fruit of the banana. The fruit, of course, not inherent to bananas, not to human beings, is for the purpose of reproduction of the tree or whatever bananas grow on trees.
Adama.
Not like money, right? It's to make adama, the banana bush. So the banana is for purposes of the plant's reproduction, and it needs a protection from its peel, right, over the fruit. Once you open up the banana and you eat the inner, you eat the banana part, right? The peel becomes left over as a thing in and of itself, right? And now you have an object called a banana peel. And in fact, you've created in this process, right, something that is a new object. There's a new thing now called the banana peel that never existed before. By eating the inner banana, you actually create the banana peel. Yes? In the metaphor, this is exactly how the Klippa and Sitra Achra come about. That's why it's called the shell or a peel, right? That process of making all of those metaphors is like the eating of the banana, right? In other words, the banana, the inner banana that you eat is the divine vitality, the divine light of God, right? Which shows that the metaphor is obviously an expression of the thing that it's expressing, right? This is only an expression, yeah? In the initial reality, in this world, before eating from the tree of knowledge, which is what caused all of it to be the way it is now. And the fact is that even in higher worlds, there's Klippa and Sitra Achra, as we're going to see in chapter 7, God willing. Klippa and Sitra Achra is not just in the lowest world, but it exists in higher worlds as well. This is one of the ways in which it's more complicated. But the Klippa and Sitra Achra is not a bad thing, bad in the sense of somehow not part of the plan. On the contrary, it's the first part of the banana that grows. The Klippa and Sitra Achra exist to protect the fruit. The peel exists to protect the fruit. The Klippa and Sitra Achra exists to be the greatest manifestation of God. Why is it the greatest manifestation? Because the more metaphors you can make, the further you show the idea to be pertinent, right? If you could somehow bring the Mishnah into the furthest possible metaphor, that just shows the greatness of the Mishnah. The Mishnah pertains to everything and is relevant to everything and reaches the lowest student, right? So in other words, the Klippa and Sitra Achra are the greatest manifestation of the teacher. Rebbe was the greatest teacher because look at the low student through thousands of metaphors, right, that his teaching can reach. The Klippa and Sitra Achra is the same, right? When do the problems start? The problems start when it becomes a davar nifrat, right? The Klippa and Sitra Achra attain their state that they have now in our reality, where they are vying for their own existence. When the banana peel says, I exist as a peel, not as part of a banana, that's when the problem starts. And that's what we mean, what Alter Rebbe means when he says that it's inside a davar nifrad, right? We don't mind that the divine light becomes extremely contracted and limited through many tzimtzumim. On the contrary, everything holy in our world, right? The Sefer Torah, the Tefillin, right? Godliness has to come down and become a literal physical object. It's an incredible descent for godliness, right? But these things are not peels that become separate. These are just part of the banana, so to speak, right? In other words, Kedusha is things that agree that they are just part of the banana. They're like one of the layers of the fruit of the banana, right? It's all one thing. There's just one banana, right? The peel, the outer shell, right? The shell of the nut, the peel of the banana is something where the banana, it wouldn't exist if there was no banana. You would have no banana peel if there was no banana. And yet it says, I'm my own separate thing. I'm a separate object. I'm an object with my own existence, right? The Basi Lagani this year says this is exactly what Pare did, right? Pharaoh is the lowest level of klipa in the Basi Lagani, right? The lowest possible place. Godliness is expressed in the lowest possible place. What did Pare do, right? Jacob came to Pharaoh and he said and blessed him that the waters should rise. When Pare comes to the Nile should rise in his presence. And the plan that Yaakov had was that he would lift up Egypt, and Egypt would be lifted up by him, and everyone would be rich and happy and wealthy and holy, and everything would be wonderful in Egypt. That was the plan, right? That's why Yaakov blesses Pharaoh, right? Yaakov blesses Pharaoh because on the contrary, right? On the contrary, that's what we say. That's why in Chassidus and Kabbalah, Paro is said to be of such a high, Pharaoh is said to be of such a high godly madrega, right? Because if Pharaoh acquiesces and he agrees that the whole country can be blessed by Yaakov, if he has bittul, right, and he says, all of my blessings come from Jacob and his God, right? Egypt could have just been another part of the banana. And that was Yaakov's plan, right? And look how great godliness is, that even in a place like Egypt and a person like Paroi, godliness can be expressed there. It would have been Kedusha, it would have been bittul. What's the problem? Paroi had no intention of being bittul. He had his own plans, right? And Pharaoh eventually says, Liya Ya'er v'aniya sisini, as we famously quote in Chassidus from Yechezkel, from Ezekiel, that the river is mine and I've created it for myself, right? Paroi eventually says, this whole blessing is because of me. Right? Why is Pharaoh alive when he says that? Because Jacob blessed him. That's Klippa and Sitra Achra. Klippa and Sitra Achra is taking the vitality that is giving them life, right? That makes their whole country, what makes Egypt so rich and Pharaoh so wealthy and powerful and alive? The very blessing that he is denying by saying, the river is mine and I've created it for myself, right? It's the banana peel that says, never heard of a banana. I'm my own thing, right? That is the mashal of Klippa. That's the word Klippa, right? Klippa says, I have my own vitality. And that's why when the divine vitality, like for example, the blessing of Jacob in Pharaoh, right? Or any divine vitality in Klippa, right? When God makes Klippa exist, how does the divine vitality express there in a state of what's called galus, or what's called exile? Why is it called exile? Because in exile, a person doesn't have the freedom, right, or the power to express themselves as they would like. That's really the idea of exile, right? So godliness is in exile. There's the exile of the Shekhinah. When the Jewish people were exiled, the Shekhinah went into exile with them, as we all know, right? So the exile of the Shekhinah is in the Klippa and the Sitra Achra, which means that godliness is giving vitality and making exist something that denies God its own secondary nature to godliness, something that has no bittul. And so, through the descent of the divine vitality, right, where it becomes very, very, very limited and small to give vitality to things that are very distant from Hashem, right, that is the opportunity. It's like eating the banana for the peel to say, I'm a separate existence. I'm my own existence. I don't exist to protect something else. I don't exist for the purpose of something else. I have my own vitality. That's why the world, one of the reasons why we call these things that are in denial of their own godly vitality, we call them the peel or the shell, klipa, right? So these are the two names, klipa and sitra achra. I see we're over time already. Would you like to go a little bit further, or should we cut it short here? I'll put it up to a vote.
If you want to wrap the chapter, go ahead.
There is not a chance for wrapping the chapter.
Why? There's like 3 lines.
Seriously?
No, the 6
It's the whole next page.
No, but the half lines.
Yeah, we have to do the Haggah. The Haggah counts. The other half of the lines count as well. Not a chance. Not a chance. Okay, would you like to stop here or would you like to continue? Put it up to a vote.
No, stop here. Stop
Okay,
So
let's stop here.
There's
There's already enough. There's already enough for this week. Okay, God willing, we will continue. We'll continue next week.
Thank you.